On the morning of November 8, 1519, on the great causeway leading into Tenochtitlan, an Aztec attendant prepared a drink for a ruler whose empire was about to disappear. He took cacao beans. He ground them. He mixed the dark paste with water and other ingredients, then poured the liquid from one vessel into another until a thick foam formed across the surface. It was not sweet. It was not a candy, and it was not something ordinary people could simply buy in a shop. Cacao belonged to a world of ceremony, tribute, wealth, and power. The Spanish men approaching the city had never tasted anything like it. Within a few years, they would carry cacao across the Atlantic. Europe would add sugar. Chocolate would become a luxury. Factories would turn it into a mass-produced commodity. And more than 3 centuries later, in rural Pennsylvania, a businessman named Milton Hershey would build a factory so large that he built an entire town around it. That town would help transform chocolate from an expensive indulgence into one of America's most recognizable mass-market foods. But none of that began in Pennsylvania. It began in the tropical Americas, with a tree that produced a fruit nobody would mistake for a chocolate bar. The cacao tree grows in warm, humid regions close to the equator. Its flowers are tiny and unusual, growing directly from the trunk and older branches rather than only from the newest growth. From those flowers come the pods. They can be yellow, green, red, orange, or shades in between, depending on the variety and stage of ripeness. Inside each pod are rows of seeds surrounded by a pale, sweet pulp. Those seeds are cacao. Everything that eventually becomes cocoa powder, cocoa butter, and chocolate begins there. But freshly removed cacao seeds do not taste like chocolate. They are bitter. Their familiar chocolate character develops only after fermentation, drying, roasting, grinding, and further processing. That means cacao was never simply discovered and eaten. It had to be transformed. And humans in Mesoamerica had been transforming it for thousands of years before Europeans ever encountered it. Some of the earliest archaeological evidence for cacao use comes from the Pacific coast of what is now southern Mexico and Central America. Around 1900 BC, people associated with the Mochaya culture were already consuming cacao in some form. Chemical residues preserved inside ancient pottery provide evidence that cacao was being processed and consumed long before the great cities of the Maya or the Aztecs reached their height. That changes the way we should think about chocolate history. The Aztecs did not invent cacao, the Spanish did not discover it, and Europe certainly did not create it. Cacao already had a long history. Different Mesoamerican cultures used it in different ways, and the exact recipes changed across time and place. The sweet pulp could be consumed, the beans could be fermented, the roasted seeds could be ground into a paste. The paste could be mixed with water, maize, spices, or other ingredients. The result was often a frothy drink. That foam mattered. The liquid could be poured repeatedly between vessels or beaten with specialized tools to create a thick layer of bubbles. The drink could be bitter. It could be spicy. It could be strongly flavored. It was nothing like the sugary milk chocolate that would eventually dominate the world. Among the Maya, cacao became deeply connected to elite life and ritual. Ancient Maya vessels show scenes of people consuming cacao beverages, often in contexts associated with rulers, ceremonies, and social gatherings. Cacao also appeared in mythology. It was not simply food. It was part of the symbolic world through which Mesoamerican societies understood life, death, fertility, power, and the relationship between humans and the supernatural. The cacao tree itself could carry meaning because it produced food from its trunk and branches in an environment where tropical forests seemed almost impossibly productive. And the beans had another quality that made them extraordinarily useful. They could be counted. That made them money. In parts of Mesoamerica, cacao beans circulated as a medium of exchange. A person did not need a stamped coin to make a small transaction. A quantity of cacao beans could serve the purpose. The exact values varied by place and period, but the principle was simple. The seed inside a tropical fruit had become a unit of economic value. That tells us something important about the societies that used cacao. It was not merely a luxury drink. It had entered the economy. And by the 15th century, cacao was deeply embedded in the world of the Mexica, the people more commonly called the Aztecs. The Mexica had built a powerful empire centered on Tenochtitlan, an enormous city constructed on islands and connected to the surrounding mainland by causeways. The city was one of the largest urban centers in the world at the time. Its markets were crowded. Its canals carried people and goods. Its rulers controlled tribute from conquered territories, and cacao moved through that system. The beans were particularly associated with regions capable of producing them. The climate around central Mexico was not ideal for cacao cultivation, so the empire depended on supplies coming from warmer territories. That made cacao part of the tribute economy. Conquered peoples could be required to deliver agricultural products and other valuable goods to the imperial center. Cacao was among the commodities that moved northward. The empire did not have to grow the beans itself. It could control the flow. That is what empires do. They turn geography into political power. The cacao-growing regions were far from Tenochtitlan, but imperial authority could connect them to the capital. The beans arrived. They were counted, stored, traded, consumed, and sometimes used as money. The drink itself was associated strongly with elites. Spanish accounts written after the conquest describe cacao beverages being prepared for members of the Aztec ruling class. One of the most famous accounts concerns Moctezuma II, whose court was said to receive large quantities of cacao-based drinks. The surviving descriptions must be treated carefully because the Spanish observers were outsiders writing about a society they were in the process of conquering. But the broader evidence is clear. Cacao mattered. It was valuable enough to move through tribute networks. It was important enough to appear in ritual and elite settings. And it was distinctive enough that the Spanish immediately noticed it. Then came 1519. Hernán Cortés landed on the Gulf Coast of Mexico with a small Spanish expedition. The situation was complicated from the beginning. The Spanish were not entering an empty land. They encountered indigenous states with their own armies, rivalries, alliances, markets, languages, and political systems. Some indigenous groups opposed the Mexica. Others saw the newcomers as potential allies against imperial domination. The Spanish exploited those divisions. They advanced toward Tenochtitlan, and on November 8, 1519, Cortés and his forces entered the great Aztec capital. The meeting between Moctezuma and Cortés has been retold countless times, but one detail matters for the history of chocolate. The Europeans encountered cacao as part of the food and economic system of the empire. They saw the beans, they saw the drink, and they recognized value. The conquest that followed destroyed the political structure that had controlled central Mexico. Tenochtitlan fell in 1521. The Spanish began reorganizing the territory, and cacao entered a completely different economic system. The beans were still valuable, but now they were connected to the Spanish Empire. Cacao could be cultivated under colonial rule. It could be collected, taxed, traded, and shipped. But the Spanish did something else that mattered even more. They changed the taste. The bitter cacao drink did not fit naturally into European preferences. Sugar did. Sugar had already become an important commodity in the Mediterranean and Atlantic worlds. European producers had experience with sweetened drinks and confectionery, so the two commodities came together. Cacao and sugar, bitter and sweet. The combination was transformative. Spices could also be added. The drink could be served hot. Recipes changed. Techniques changed. And gradually, chocolate became something Europeans could imagine as their own. That was the beginning of a long cultural transformation. The cacao bean was American. The European chocolate tradition was not. It was created through adaptation. The Spanish initially kept chocolate relatively exclusive. They controlled access to cacao through their colonial networks and brought the drink into elite circles. The beverage became associated with wealth. Then it moved beyond Spain. Chocolate reached other parts of Europe through royal families, trade networks, marriage alliances, merchants, and religious communities. By the 17th century, chocolate was established as a luxury drink in European society. It appeared at courts. It entered aristocratic households. Chocolate houses emerged. In London, establishments specializing in chocolate drinks became places where wealthy men gathered to socialize, conduct business, and discuss politics. Chocolate was no longer a Mesoamerican ritual beverage. It had become a European luxury. If you're enjoying this one, this is a good time to hit subscribe. Every week we dig into the hidden history behind everyday fruit and vegetables, and there's a lot more of this coming. But there was a problem. Luxury is expensive. Cacao had to travel across the Atlantic. Sugar had to be produced and transported. The beans had to be processed. Preparing the drink required specialized labor. For centuries, chocolate remained beyond the reach of most people. A peasant could know what cacao was without ever tasting it. A laborer could live in a society that imported chocolate without being able to afford it. The chocolate industry was waiting for technology. Then, technology arrived. The first major transformation was not the chocolate bar, it was the machine. In 1828, Dutch chemist Coenraad Johannes van Houten patented a hydraulic press that could remove much of the cocoa butter from roasted cacao mass. The remaining material could be ground into a fine powder. This changed chocolate production. Cocoa powder was easier to mix into liquids. It could be used in baking. It could be combined with sugar more consistently, and the separation of cocoa solids and cocoa butter gave manufacturers greater control over the final product. Chocolate was becoming an industrial material. Then came the bar. In 1847, the English company J.S. Fry & Sons developed a process for producing a solid chocolate bar by combining cocoa powder, cocoa butter, and sugar. The change sounds simple. It was not. A drink had become a portable food. Chocolate could now be molded, wrapped, transported, stored, sold. It could be eaten without a cup. That opened a new market. And once chocolate became something factories could manufacture consistently, competition accelerated. Swiss manufacturers made important advances in milk chocolate and refining. Daniel Peter developed milk chocolate using condensed milk in the 1870s. Rodolph Lindt developed the conching process in 1879, improving the texture and smoothness of chocolate. The industry was learning how to make chocolate not merely edible, but luxurious in a new industrial sense. Smooth, uniform, meltable, consistent. The old chocolate drink had been transformed into a manufactured product. But Europe was not the only place where chocolate was changing. Across the Atlantic, American entrepreneurs were watching. The United States was entering an age of mass production. Factories were becoming larger. Railroads were connecting markets. Advertising was becoming more sophisticated. Consumers were buying packaged goods on a scale earlier generations had never seen. And one man saw an opportunity. His name was Milton Snavely Hershey. Hershey was born in Pennsylvania in 1857. His early career was not an immediate success. He apprenticed in a confectionery business in Lancaster, failed in an early candy venture in Philadelphia, and eventually found success making caramels. The caramel business made him wealthy. More importantly, it taught him something. He learned how to produce confectionery on an industrial scale. He learned distribution. He learned packaging. He learned that a product did not have to be reserved for the wealthy if a manufacturer could lower the cost enough. Then he turned toward chocolate. In 1894, Hershey established the Hershey Chocolate Company. He had not invented chocolate. He had not invented milk chocolate. He had not even been the first American to make chocolate bars. His contribution was scale. He wanted chocolate that ordinary Americans could afford. That required a factory capable of producing enormous quantities with consistent quality. And that required infrastructure. Hershey eventually found the location he wanted in rural central Pennsylvania. The land was close to dairy farms, it was connected to transportation, and it gave him room to build. In 1903, construction began on what became the Hershey Chocolate Factory. The factory was enormous for its time. But Hershey was not simply building a factory, he was building a system. Milk had to arrive, sugar had to arrive, cacao had to arrive, workers had to live nearby, finished chocolate had to leave, and all of those movements had to happen reliably. So Hershey built more than production facilities. He built a town. The community around the factory eventually became known simply as Hershey. There were homes, schools, parks, stores, recreation facilities, transportation infrastructure. The factory dominated the economic life of the community. This was company town capitalism. The employer did not merely provide jobs. The company shaped the environment in which workers lived. For Hershey, that environment served a practical purpose: a stable workforce, a permanent production center, a community tied to the factory, and a visible symbol of the company itself. The town and the chocolate became inseparable. But there was another reason Pennsylvania mattered: milk. Hershey's product depended on milk chocolate, and Pennsylvania was surrounded by dairy farms. That made the region unusually well-suited to large-scale production. Fresh milk could be sourced locally. The factory could process it. Sugar and cacao could arrive through national transportation networks. Machines could convert all of those raw materials into standardized chocolate. The cacao itself still came from thousands of miles away. That was the paradox. The chocolate bar looked American. Its most important agricultural ingredient was tropical. The factory was in Pennsylvania. The cacao tree could not survive there. The industrial system connected the two. That connection was the real achievement. A cacao farmer in a tropical region and a consumer in Pennsylvania could become part of the same economic chain. The farmer might never see the final chocolate. The consumer might never see a cacao tree. The factory stood between them, and the bigger the factory became, the more invisible the farm became. This is where the history of chocolate takes a darker turn. Industrial chocolate required enormous quantities of cacao. Demand was no longer limited to aristocrats. Millions of consumers could now buy chocolate. That meant millions of chocolate bars required millions of pounds of cacao. The pressure moved backward. More plantations, more farms, more labor, more land. European colonial powers expanded cacao production in tropical regions across Africa, the Americas, and Southeast Asia. And the labor systems behind those plantations were often brutal. Cacao had long been connected to coerced labor under colonial rule in the Americas. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, forced labor and other exploitative systems also appeared in cacao-producing regions outside the Americas. The global chocolate industry was becoming more efficient at the factory end, while agricultural labor remained intensely demanding. Cacao pods are harvested individually. Workers open them. Beans are removed. The beans are fermented. Then they are dried. Much of the work is done by hand. The factory can process enormous quantities. The farm still depends heavily on human labor. That imbalance remains visible today. Modern global cacao production is dominated by smallholder farmers, particularly in West Africa. Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana together produce a huge share of the world's cacao. Millions of farmers and workers depend on the crop, but cacao prices are determined by a global market that individual farmers cannot control. A poor harvest can reduce income, disease can destroy trees, weather can damage production, and when global prices fall, farmers feel the pressure. Chocolate may be cheap for consumers. Cacao production is not necessarily profitable for the people growing it. That contradiction is built into the modern industry. The product became mass market. The raw material remained vulnerable to geography and labor. Child labor is another documented problem in parts of the West African cacao industry. Investigations over several decades have found children performing hazardous agricultural work on some farms in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. Governments, companies, and international organizations have introduced programs designed to reduce child labor and improve farmer incomes. Progress has been uneven. The problem has not disappeared. That matters because the chocolate bar is often marketed as pleasure without history. You unwrap it, you eat it. The process is invisible. But every bar has a supply chain. Someone planted the tree, someone maintained it, someone harvested the pods, someone opened them, someone fermented the beans, someone dried them, someone transported them, someone processed them, and someone eventually turned them into the product sitting in your hand. The factory hides the farm, the packaging hides the labor. Industrial chocolate is extraordinarily good at making its origins disappear. Think about that for a second. The modern chocolate bar is one of the most recognizable examples of industrial food because it looks simple: a rectangle, a wrapper, a brand. But behind that rectangle is a global network stretching across continents, and Milton Hershey's achievement was to make that network serve an enormous American consumer market. His company expanded production. It expanded distribution. It made milk chocolate recognizable to generations of Americans. And the town surrounding the factory turned the brand into a physical place. You could visit Hershey. You could see the factory. You could live in the community. You could work there. You could raise a family there. The company became part manufacturer, part employer, part local institution. That was not accidental. Hershey believed that workers and their families should have access to housing, education, recreation, and community institutions. At the same time, the company town model gave the corporation enormous influence over local life. The same system that provided stability also concentrated economic power. The factory was the center of everything, and the factory existed to make one thing: chocolate. By the early 20th century, chocolate had crossed another threshold. It was no longer simply a luxury. It was part of American popular culture. Chocolate appeared in candy bars, baking products, drinks, desserts, and holiday traditions. It became associated with Valentine's Day, Easter, Halloween, Christmas, birthdays, movies, sporting events. The product had moved from ceremony to commerce, from elite luxury to mass entertainment, and the transformation was not finished. The 20th century brought refrigeration, supermarkets, national advertising, modern packaging, mechanized transportation, and increasingly sophisticated food manufacturing. Each development made chocolate easier to distribute. The supermarket did something particularly important. It placed packaged chocolate beside hundreds of other standardized products. The consumer no longer had to visit a specialist. Chocolate was simply there. That changed the psychology of consumption. Chocolate became ordinary, but ordinary does not mean unimportant. In fact, becoming ordinary was the greatest victory. A luxury consumed by a few wealthy people can generate profit. A cheap product consumed by millions can reshape an industry. Hershey understood that. The company did not need every American to buy expensive chocolate. It needed ordinary people to buy affordable chocolate often. That was the mass market model. Lower the cost, increase the volume, expand distribution, standardize the product, build the brand, repeat. And cacao became the raw material for that system. The tree itself remained almost completely unchanged. The factory changed everything around it. Today, cacao is grown across tropical regions in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. West Africa dominates global production. Côte d'Ivoire is the world's largest producer, with Ghana also among the leading producers. Indonesia, Ecuador, Nigeria, Cameroon, Brazil, and other countries contribute significant quantities. The exact ranking and annual production numbers change with weather, disease, prices, and harvest conditions. But the geographic pattern is clear. Cacao grows near the equator. Chocolate is consumed almost everywhere. That means the modern chocolate industry depends on a permanent geographical separation between production and consumption. The people growing cacao are concentrated in tropical regions. The largest chocolate markets are concentrated in wealthier consumer economies. That separation creates enormous logistical systems. Beans travel from farms to local buying stations. From there, they move to exporters, then ports, then ships, then processors, then chocolate manufacturers, then distribution centers, then stores, then the consumer. A chocolate bar can cross an ocean before it reaches your hand. And yet the original product remains almost absurdly simple. A seed, inside a pod, on a tree. That is what makes cacao such a remarkable historical commodity. Its value is not obvious when you look at the fruit. The value comes from everything humans learned to do with it. Ferment it, roast it, grind it, press it, mix it, sweeten it, refine it, package it, market it, sell it. The history of cacao is therefore a history of human transformation. The Maya transformed it into ritual. The Aztecs integrated it into tribute and trade. The Spanish transformed its taste. Europe transformed it into luxury. Industrial chemists transformed its texture and production. Factories transformed it into a commodity. And Milton Hershey transformed that commodity into an American mass product. That last transformation is the one most people encounter. You do not walk into a store and buy a cacao pod. You buy chocolate. That distinction took centuries to create, and Hershey's Pennsylvania factory became one of the clearest symbols of the process. A tropical crop entered a Pennsylvania factory. The factory turned it into a standardized product. The product entered a national distribution network. The brand became part of American life, and the town itself became part of the brand. The company had effectively built an ecosystem around chocolate. That is why Hershey matters in the history of cacao. Not because one man invented chocolate. He didn't. Not because he discovered cacao. He didn't. Not because he created the first chocolate bar. He didn't. He mattered because he understood what industrialization could do to an old luxury. He could take something that had been consumed by rulers and aristocrats and manufacture it in quantities large enough for ordinary people. That required a factory. It required milk. It required transportation. It required workers. It required packaging. It required advertising. And it required a town. The final product looked simple. The system behind it was not. And that system changed the meaning of chocolate forever. For thousands of years, cacao had been associated with ceremony, wealth, and status. By the 20th century, a child could buy a chocolate bar with pocket money. That is an extraordinary economic transformation. The ingredient did not become cheaper because the cacao tree suddenly became more productive. It became cheaper because humans built machines, supply chains, factories, transportation networks, and markets capable of processing enormous quantities. The chocolate bar was the visible result. The industrial system was the real invention. And that brings the story back to the beginning. Imagine that Aztec attendant on the causeway in 1519. He is holding a drink made from a seed that grew thousands of miles from the world that will eventually consume it. He has no reason to imagine a chocolate factory, no reason to imagine a candy bar, no reason to imagine Pennsylvania, no reason to imagine a product sold in supermarkets across the planet. For him, cacao already has meaning. It belongs to a world of ceremony and power. The Spanish arrive, the empire falls, the bean crosses the Atlantic, sugar changes the taste, European elites turn it into luxury, chemists change the process, factories change the scale. And finally, Milton Hershey builds a town around the idea that chocolate should be cheap enough for ordinary Americans. The distance between those two moments is more than 400 years. The cacao bean made the journey, but it did not make it alone. Empires carried it, farmers grew it, workers harvested it, merchants traded it. Chemists transformed it, Factories standardized it, and consumers created the demand that kept the entire system expanding. That is the history of cacao, not simply the story of how a bitter seed became chocolate. It is the story of how a sacred Mesoamerican crop was pulled into the machinery of global capitalism. And Milton Hershey represents one of the final stages of that transformation. He did not make chocolate important. Cacao had been important for thousands of years. He made chocolate ordinary. And once chocolate became ordinary, the world would never treat it the same way again. The cacao tree still grows in the tropical forest. Its flowers still emerge from its trunk. Its pods still ripen. Its seeds still taste bitter before fermentation and roasting transform them. But the modern chocolate bar carries almost none of that original appearance. That is the ultimate industrial trick. Take something distant, transform it completely. Give it a familiar shape, put it behind a brand, and make millions of people forget where it came from. The next time you unwrap a chocolate bar, there is a history inside it that is much older than the wrapper. A history of ritual, conquest, sugar, colonial trade, chemistry, factories, labor. And one Pennsylvania town built around a machine for turning a tropical seed into something almost everyone could afford. The Maya gave cacao meaning. The Aztecs gave it economic power. Europe gave it sugar. Industry gave it scale. And Hershey helped give it to the masses. That is how cacao became chocolate. And that is how chocolate became ordinary. If you enjoyed this deep dive, subscribe. We cover the hidden history behind everyday fruit and vegetables every week, and there's a lot more coming. And tell me in the comments, which everyday fruit or vegetable should we follow from its ancient origins to the modern factory next?